Paul would have loved the ideas of tonight's talk. He and Will and Chris Dornan, if he's here, doesn't matter, but we're all graduate students together at McGill in the 80s, so long ago. And for a while, Will taught in film studies here at Carleton before going back to McGill as a faculty member in initially communication, and then all the rest over there. Very handy for information compression. Paul would have liked this talk because, going by the title, it brings together two ideas not usually thought of as together: media and forensics. And a third tricky cluster of ideas, the Canadian cultural commodity. So, media and forensics, that is, that a crime or injustice occurred at some time in the past, and their articulation through the Canadian cultural commodity. A commodity, as Marx taught us, is, quote, at first sight a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis, however, shows that it is in reality a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theoretical niceties, end quote, and, as we shall see, psychological traits as well, such as dissimulation and deception. In a word, there is something louche about the commodity, and the Canadian cultural commodity perhaps even more so. Something dodgy, not quite right, indeed suspicious. To track the commodity, then, we need someone who deals with the louche, a detective of sorts and a scholar. A Will Straw, perhaps, more specifically, a specialist in print culture and urban sensationalism, whose research has studied louche cultural products such as true crime, true confessional literature, and true romance magazines. And this in the Canadian, Quebecois, French, Mexican, and American contexts from the 1920s, more or less, to the 1960s. And he has spoken to some of these topics, as far as I can tell from his Twitter postings, all over the Western hemispheres. With titles to his credit, such as Cyanide and Sin, Improvisation and Social Aesthetics, Circulation in the City, Global Cities, Local Sites, The Cambridge Companion to Rock and Pop, Canadian Identity, Region, Country, Nation, and impressively many others, Will is the ideal speaker to address tonight's topic. And so, without further ado, I'm very pleased to give you the James McGill Professor of Urban Media Studies at McGill University, Dr. Will Straw.
Well, thank you to Josh and to all others who extended the invitation, helped me with the trip, Ira, and thank you, Michael. This is the man I've respected for many, many years, and to have you introduce me is an honor. I'm really deeply moved and honored to be here tonight. I'm honored in particular to be doing this lecture in the name of Paul Attallah, whom I met over 40 years ago. We were both 1 year old now, huh? And about whom I will say more in a minute, but I'm honored as well to be here to help you celebrate the 40th anniversary of what I really think is an extraordinary communications program that you've built. And I'm also very scared and nervous because I'm speaking in front of some of the smartest people I know and have ever known. A little bit of a personal introduction. My connections to Carleton and to what was journalism run fairly deep and long. At the age of 18, I came to Carleton to study journalism with the dream of becoming a crusading to study journalism. In those early days, the early 70s, the journalism school at Carleton, like a great deal else at this university, seemed to have been taken over by hippies. And I remember my parents, who'd never been to university, driving me up from Southern Ontario, dropping me off on campus, and warning me that probably all the male students would be wearing shirts and ties every day, and that I better get on that program. It became very clear that that was not the case. But my strongest memories of in journalism were my Journalism 100 tutorial group, where in the first meeting we were asked to all lie down on the floor, hold hands with the person beside us, who of course we'd never met, and tell them something we liked. These, again, were total strangers, and I still sometimes wake up screaming, remembering this moment. In my second year, I dropped or flunked out of journalism, depending on whether I was talking to my parents or my friends, and enrolled in the Film Studies BA program, which had just started. And that program, it celebrated its own 40th anniversary earlier this year. I see Mark Firstenow is here. And I'd regularly, as a film studies student, go to see films at the old Canadian Film Institute screenings at the National Library on Wellington. And it was in one of those meetings, sometimes I think sometime in the first half of 1978, that I first met Paul Attallah. He was there with a mutual friend. We chatted, and in the course of our brief conversation, he mentioned that he'd applied to do the Master's in Communications at McGill. And I answered, well, so have I. And we each moved to Montreal in the fall of 1978 and turned up on the same first day of classes in the old graduate program in communications offices at McGill. Over the next 2 years, we took most of the same courses, hung out together a few times a week with our cohort, both stayed on for the doctorate. We had a reading group where we read all 3 volumes of Capital, Marx's Capital, and so on. And Paul and I worked for a long time with Gertrude G.G. Robinson on a research project analyzing television coverage of the first referendum on Quebec independence. That's how long ago this was. And my first conference paper, and probably Paul's first too, was one we co-wrote as part of this project. In 1984, I came back to teach for 9 years to teach film studies. Paul came after to teach Mass Comm, and I watched with a certain sense of missing out. I was on the 4th floor of St. Pat's, you were on the 3rd, as Paul and Eileen Saunders and Michael Doran and so many others turned this into one of the very best communications programs in the country. The accomplishments of your program are numerous. I mean, you played a key role in building the Canadian Communications Association, supplying so many of its presidents. Many of you, and Eileen Saunders in particular, and then Cheryl Hamilton, who came later, helped make feminist work so central to the discipline of communications in Canada. Like the program at Concordia, you've always been open to Francophone and Anglophone currents, and virtually alone, I think, and this is what impresses me perhaps most about your program, is that you found an equilibrium between the study of cultural policy, the critique of political economy, communications history, and the traditions of cultural studies. And what really amazes me is the number of fabulous new professors you've hired in just the last few years. I was talking about this with Josh. Paul Attallah's work to me always exemplified some of the finest qualities of the program and of the discipline as a whole in Canada. He showed a deep interest in questions of cultural form. Paul could analyze a text with his eyes closed, but this was always interwoven with the sense that form and message are bound up inevitably with questions of public policy, of how culture gets funded and distributed, and how it finds or does not its publics. And I'd like to conclude this preface with just a personal note before moving to my talk itself. Paul Attallah was born in the same year I was, me in August, Paul in November, and I was born 1 month after Marty Allor from Concordia University, who many of you perhaps knew well, and who passed away in February of 2016. It's hard for me when I reflect upon these losses, not to feel, I admit, a little twinge of survivor's guilt, or at the very least, a sense of premature generational loss. And I'm glad that my cohort and my friendship circles are not only made up of baby boomer men born within 3 months of each other, but nevertheless, Paul and Marty meant a lot to me at key points in my life and quite obviously left us too soon. Okay, when Josh sent me the invitation to be here, there are many things I thought I might talk about. A lot of my current research is in an emerging field, well, I think it's an emerging field, I'm not sure anybody else does, called night studies. Studies of the way in which cities organize, represent, and regulate their nights. But this doesn't have a lot to do with communications, so it didn't seem appropriate to talk about it here. And to be honest, I did a couple of years ago over in film studies. I have a new SSHRC-funded project that deals with science fiction fandom and fanzines and with 20th century technologies of mimeography. But you already have Benjamin Wu here anyways, so he can talk about these things better than I can. But I got excited by the opportunity to do something I've thought about for many years, but never really pushed forward. And that's to try and tie together a lot of little research projects I've done over the years on the making of magazines, books, musical recordings, and films in this space that we call Canada. And all of this work has been, at least in part, a reflection on what it means to produce cultural commodities in the cities, typically, of Canada. By media forensics, and I'll say more about that in a minute, I mean the practice of reading and interpreting Canadian cultural commodities to find the traces of the conditions under which they're made, the pressures that shape them, and the calculations, however grandiose or pathetic, that presided over their making, as well as all the louche and other things that Michael referred to. So these, this is the tasting menu, these are some of the things that I'll be talking about. They're all 20th century, all analog, and they're almost all minor. I mean, minor, in a sense, dignifies some of them, obscure and trivial. Now, for years, I used to quote this phrase from Swedish ethnologist Orvar Lofgren that I sort of returned to as I was writing this. Can you read it? Where he's called for the study of what he calls the nationalization of trivialities, the study of what he calls as well the national trajectory of commodities. How do things move in a national culture, and especially the most trivial ones? And what does their movement tell us about the making of culture in that particular context? And so it's in the spirit of this call that I'm going to return to some of these things today. I'm going to speak a little bit about film, but I'm going to circle around two of the kind of clusters of cultural production that have most fascinated me for several years, and on which I keep working in dribs and drabs when I have the time. One of these is a cluster of legitimate and semi-legitimate publishers based in Toronto in the 1940s, who were engaged in producing books and magazines of low repute and low esteem. The other is a set of overlapping networks of people, companies, places involved in making and selling disco music recordings in Montreal. And I was pleased when I got to meet your provost that he was telling me I knew all about Montreal disco in the 70s, although I'm not sure he's quite old enough to, but he's gone, right? Okay, to be there. I've written on both of these before mostly in terms of networks and the movement of people, but I really want to talk about them today in terms of objects, things, media artifacts, and cultural commodities. But I want to begin by showing you three of my favorite moments in film history. This is the title sequence of a Canadian film released officially in 1971, but then its sort of subsequent commercial release was delayed until 1973. The original title of the film was Golden Apples of the Sun, based on a line in a poem by W.B. Yeats, which suggests something of the pretensions and ambition that presided over its making. And it was made by filmmakers who left the National Film Board in the late 60s to move into feature filmmaking. And the film is the story of a couple of hippies from Montreal who go camping in Vermont, where they're kidnapped and held hostage by Vietnam vets from the United States who are hanging out in the Vermont woods. You've seen that film 100 times, I know. The film is in large part about differences between Canada and the US, about how the violence of war comes to even the most pastoral of settings, and so on. But under its original title, the film was something of a flop. Probably like most films that have apples in the title, I think. I don't know. So the rights were sold to distributors of sort of grindhouse schlock films in the United States. Golden Apples of the Sun was briefly retitled Ever After All, but that title didn't catch fire either. So it was retitled again, and it circulated mostly as a film called Caged Terror, and began turning up under this title on cheap VHS tapes in the 1980s. As viewers noted, the film is hardly horrific. The Canadians are held hostage and assaulted by American Vietnam veterans, but most of the film is taken up with a camping trip. One snarky critic says it's the only film with a camping trip shown in real time. And a lot of the viewing time is spent listening to hippie music and watching slow dissolves. Now, to me, the most compelling, interesting thing in the film comes in the credits, where you have live action footage of the characters strolling through the Vermont countryside, and this is halted all of a sudden by the imposition of the film's new title, Caged Terror. And you basically have the imposition of a slide stuck in the middle of live action, obviously many years after the film was made, that tries to approximate the color schemes of what preceded it, but something new has clearly been imposed and inserted where something else used to be. But so I'm interested in the imposition of this title slide, which does many things. It wrestles the film away from its original purpose and its original sense of place, even as a pastoral hippie exploration of cross-border differences. It repurposes the film as a backwoods horror story, a genre that was already had some traction by 1980. It sets the film moving on new circuits of distribution into the market for horror films circulating only on video cassette. And in a move with perhaps the most relevance for what I'm going to be talking about, the new title takes a commodity that is already several years old, 5 or 6 years by this point, of faded cultural value, and dresses it up as something more recent. And like magazine covers, record album covers, the ornamental facade of buildings, film credits often function deceptively to hide the musty and the exhausted behind the appearance of the new. And the appearance of the Caged Terror title slide on this copy of the film allows us to date the copy in relationship to the larger history of the film as an artifact. The title, the fonts are all later than the film itself, and so we can already see it starting to fall apart. Now, from this superimposed title, which is really all that's maybe interesting about the film, we can decipher some of the life of this film as a commodity, as an artifact. And I would call this deciphering, maybe a little grandiosely, a media forensics. This is not just because the new title represents a kind of symbolic violence. It cuts the film at a moment. Something is clearly stamped on it by the new owners. Or even because this violence somehow stands analogously for the broader relationship of the US film industries to the Canadian independent art cinema of the time. But it's also because if we take this simple slide and try and decipher it, we can move back from it or up from it to reconstruct the broader history of the film as a circulating commodity whose life cycle was one of constant transformation and betrayal, even, we might say. Now, as many of you might know, there's a growing and significant scholarly literature on the relationship of forensics to media. Forensics, of course, is the reading of traces, of marks, of usage and change on bodies and on materials. We associate forensics with police work, but of course it's bound up with other kinds of traces and other kinds of knowledge as well. It's now sort of almost universally agreed upon that the discipline of art history, for example, began as a kind of forensic science in its early stages when it was mostly about authenticating paintings, verifying their authorship on the basis of traces, marks, and so on. And this link between cultural knowledge and the criminological reading of clues has been well analyzed by people like Carlo Ginzburg. But the terms media and forensics circulate around each other in multiple ways. Matthew Kirschenbaum's book from about a decade ago, Mechanisms, New Media and the Forensic Imagination, is partly about reading the inscriptions left on hard drives and other digital devices. And we're all told that you can never fully erase data, that traces will always linger on hard drives or other storage devices, and therefore provide a kind of forensic knowledge. But then there's Greg Siegel's 2014 book, Forensic Media, which is about something very different. It's not about a forensics of media, but about media that are invented to perform a forensic function. All of those technologies developed since the 19th century to make traces, and in particular to record what happens in certain kinds of accidents. So forensic media are those like black box recorders in planes that record the actions taken by pilots in the event of some kind of disruption to a flight, or the machines that produce graphs showing what happened to bodies in the middle of automobile accidents. And in the present day arena of streaming music services, there's of course something called forensic royalty collection, which is about it's companies who scan YouTube and other playback or streaming sites for the traces of uses of music that go unreported, music and other intellectual property. Now, my own sense of forensics, is one that I actually borrow from histories of print culture, from those who study books and magazines and who examine the marks on physical materials, and even the physical materials themselves for clues about who owned them, where they circulated, and how they were used. Now, in what I do myself, I'm less interested in the marks left by people on the magazines and so on, although I have lots of magazines with fingerprints and other bits of mess on them. But I'm interested in the way in which the objects themselves, the magazines, the books, are subject to certain kinds of transformations in their very making. And you'll see, hopefully, in a minute, as a response to market conditions or as a response to the very predicament of trying to make something and sell something in Canada. Those who follow forensic science follow the slogan that every contact leaves a trace. That's the belief that every contact leaves a trace. Anybody who touches a body is going to leave some kind of trace, and the forensic scientist will decipher those. Well, I believe that every inscription, that is, bit of writing in the colophon or the title page of a magazine or a book, every piece of metadata that tells who published something, is the mark of a relationship. It points us towards the networks within which something was produced, and in the case of Canadian cultural commodities, these become particularly important. And I'll get to my examples in a second. Now, in this issue of the journal Theory, Culture, and Society, Jeffrey Winthrop Young, a scholar that I like, warns against the tendency in media studies to retreat into what he calls stale artifactualism. Well, when I read this, I thought, well, harumph, that's what I do. But he also links this stale artifactualism to the early days of what we call media archaeology. And he actually gets to pull off a nice line where he warns scholars against writing like it's 1999. Gets to use a Prince line. In any event, as I said, I sometimes think I'm all about the stale artifact. But those who theorize about forensics will often talk about how forensic readings bring back to life, reinvigorate, reanimate what seem to be dead objects and dead traces, making them speak their histories. And sometimes forensic writers are drawn to flights of rhetorical fancy that we could say anthropomorphize their objects. They claim that they can make bones speak or blood traces confess, and so on. Well, in a more modest way, I'm interested in getting cheap pulp magazines to confess and quasi-pornographic pamphlets to speak. Now, this is the cover of a publication called Intimate Confessions of Crime and Passion, which I thought today I should have made the title of my talk, but it was too late. Now, it's not dated, although I'm guessing it was published at some time in the mid to late 1940s. It's roughly the size of a newsstand magazine, like Time magazine, with a cardboard cover, although it's dressed up sort of like a pamphlet or thin book. There are no indications on the covers of its authorship or of the place of publication, and it was clearly marketed as a piece of softcore pornography. When we open it up, however, we find something interesting. We find that it was published by a firm, a company, an interest called Golden Books of America at 135 Yonge Street in Toronto. And above this the table of contents, we see the title Unusual Detective Cases. And this sounds like the title of a magazine rather than a book, and indeed it is. Unusual Detective Stories was one of the more lurid and misogynist of true crime magazines published in the 1940s in Toronto. This is a regular issue, which likewise bears no date of publication anywhere. So the first thing we could say about Intimate Tales of Crime and Passion, then, is that it's a magazine dressing itself up like a book. Now, the magazine Unusual Detective Cases emerged during a period now known as the Golden Age of Canadian pulp magazines, when dozens of publishers, most of them in Toronto, a few in Montreal, began publishing true crime, romance, adventure, and quasi-pornographic spicy magazines, as they were known, vaguely erotic magazines with stories or pictures. It's usually said that this golden age of the Canadian pulp magazine began quite quickly in 1940 when the Canadian government restricted the importation of American popular magazines in order to protect Canadian currency during what was already, at least for Canada, World War II. This isn't quite accurate. There had actually been a flurry of Canadian magazines before this, between 1937 and 1939, all of which were new titles that mostly repackaged things stolen from American magazines of a few years earlier. And these themselves had come about in response to a Canadian government action, which was in the mid-1930s. The Canadian government began severely stopping at the border the importation of large numbers of spicy and pulp magazines. And so you could bring single copies across as an individual, and those materials brought across in single copies were basically stolen by Canadian publishers who launched this first initial wave of Canadian magazines. Nevertheless, the wartime ban on US popular magazines, instituted in 1940, spurred a significant wave of Canadian publishing. Many of the magazines that resulted were actually written and illustrated by Canadians, but a great many as well were little more than collections of older American content repackaged with new titles and covers. And Unusual Detective Cases was one of the lowest, one of the sleaziest even, we might say. It's simply reprinted material from US magazines, mostly from the 1930s, and chose the most sensational kind of content. Now, the wartime ban on the importation of US pulps into Canada lasted until 1946. Then it was sort of dropped, but then it was brought back, but with the new proviso that Canadian publishers could now import the original art and the stories and make magazines featuring that art and those stories themselves, but they were still keeping the magazines out. But in any event, by the end of the 1940s, the golden age of Canadian pulp was over, and American periodicals of all kinds had come to dominate the Canadian market. There's quite a couple of interesting articles on the Canadian Library and Archives Canada website about this golden age. And it's fairly well covered by others, a little bit by me, but also by collectors, librarians, and scholars. Less well covered, though, are the eccentric artifacts like Intimate Tales of Crime and Passion, which floated among these magazines and invite us to come up with a less sort of celebratory account of the ways in which this golden age of pulp unfolded. Because for Library and Archives Canada, it's all about this wonderful burst of Canadian creativity. Well, it's actually also about a lot of copying and stealing and sleaze and exploitation. At the very least, looking at Intimate Tales of Crime and Passion, we can say that it reveals an act of deception. It looks like an issue of a true crime magazine, originally selling for 25 cents, has been dressed up as a sexy book and is now selling for 50 cents. And a collection of articles that basically dealt mostly with crime, some of that crime was sexualized, some of it was not, has been repackaged as a collection of erotic stories, presumably to be sold under the counter at certain kinds of magazine and bookstores, or through the mails as a single pornographic volume. And I love the fact that a publishing house in Toronto had the audacity to call itself Golden Books of America, probably to gather to itself some of the legitimacy that would come from at least half pretending it was American. Now, I want to stay with this artifact just a little bit longer. At these low levels of Canadian production, we find a number of strategies at play, and I'd like to run through some of these. The first is what I would call genre masquerade, offering a media product that pretends it's something else, typically by disguising its genre and its modes of generic address. At these levels of publication, genre masquerade mostly has to do with the pornographic. But it's interesting that this masquerade can move in two directions. You can disguise pornography as pseudo-scientific inquiry, as this little book does, Striptease, which is a psychosexual study of the vanished art of burlesque, and is written in a kind of almost academic tone. This is a one-shot publication, also from 135 Yonge Street, at which Intimate Tales of Crime and Passion was published. Or you can discuss canonical literature as pornography, as in these two examples from Toronto in the 1930s. This is, I mean, in the United States as well, Flaubert's Madame Bovary was sold with racy covers that pretended it was pornographic, as indeed in its time it was considered to be, but by 1943 or so, you know, it wasn't, there were many more extreme versions of pornography on the market. So the lurid may be dressed up in respectability, as is the case here, or the respectable may be rendered sensational by the signs of the pornographic. And certainly the drawings inside this edition of Madame Bovary resemble those that you would get in sort of erotic fiction pulp magazines. The effect of both these strategies working together across dozens of media artifacts is to produce a general sense of a degraded publishing culture. And this degradation was very much the condition of pulp publishing in Toronto in the 1940s. Now, a second strategy, if the first is genre masquerade, typical of low-level producers of the Canadian artifact, is one that I would call, I'm not thrilled with the term, but it'll do, I guess, detemporalization. And by this I mean the attempt to hide the relationship of any artifact, book, magazine, or whatever, to any punctual moment of publication. That is, you do not want to indicate when it was published. And so you publish it absent any indications of time and place of publication. Intimate Tales of Crime and Passion does this. We know where it's published, but we don't know when. And it's curious to me that it's trying to sell the content of a magazine that sold for 25 cents for 50. And my guess is that Intimate Tales of Crime and Passion was published later in the 1940s when post-war inflation made 50 cents sort of a possibly acceptable price. And when the magazine from which its materials had been stolen might well have ceased publication anyways and been forgotten, although they don't bother to change the, is that me? No. Now, there are a great many other Canadian periodicals produced during the years 1937 to 50 that contain no dates. Many, many more than you would find in the United States, for example. What do we make of this absence of concrete temporal markers? I think we can see this in part in relation to the materials that filled these periodicals. Mostly they were materials of US origin, acquired in ways that may have been legal, but were probably illegal or simply didn't involve checking on rights or even attempting to get them. Many of these materials, because of the wartime ban, had entered Canada before the war, often from low-level publishers in the US who had themselves, by this point, gone bankrupt, out of business, and lost their ability to control any rights they might have had. In particular, we find in the 1930s and 40s, and on actually both sides of the US-Canadian border, a significant traffic in detachable sexualized images of women, photographic images of women. This you can trace back to the end of the 19th century, when carte de visite on the part of burlesque performers, magazines like Broadway Magazine, began sort of detaching pin-up images of women and moving them through different sort of independent markets. And in the 30s and 40s, on the edges of pulp magazine culture, there was a whole sort of system of circulation for detachable single-page images of women in various kinds of sort of sexual poses. And magazines and books produced during this time were very often little more than just vehicles for putting a number of these things together and selling and distributing them. And so there was really no interest in numbering issues of a magazine or even dating these things. There's no attempt to develop what we can call a logic of periodicity, where this one comes after that one and you build loyalty. Rather, you just throw them out to be sold over relatively long periods of time without any sense that they're going out of date. Now, here are 3 cases of Canadian magazines stealing images from a US magazine of the 1930s. In all cases, they steal from a magazine called Film Fun. This is Garter Girls from 1937 that steals the cover image from Film Fun. There's no evidence that there was any kind of legal purchasing of the image, which would really make no sense. Film Fun again turns up on the cover of a magazine called Canadian Tatler, one of the short-lived magazines that tries to launch a Canadian pulp magazine in the late 1930s. And then National Tatler, an actual newspaper-sized magazine newspaper from Toronto, actually steals the same image as this one and puts it to illustrate a story about how Vice in Sudbury is ripped wide open. And so there's this assemblage of these objects out of materials that are circulating in these kind of nether markets, these informal markets. And this endless circulation and recirculation worked against any impulse to clearly date things. So during the golden age of Canadian pulp, we find two strategies really at work. Publishers that were aiming at some kind of respectability, and Superior, whose magazines always contained the green maple leaf, was really perhaps the most respectable. They would date, they would give their titles, their magazines, dates and years quite meticulously, because they actually felt that they could build up a continuity of readership, that they could sell subscriptions, that they could refer in one issue to what might come in the next. Whereas others, like these, would be published with no indication of month, no indication of year, and with little sense that there's going to be a second or next issue of any of those with any kind of regularity. Now, the reasons for hiding dates, of course, is to extend the possible commercial life of a magazine. If the magazine is just a collection of dirty pictures or jokes or old pulp fiction stories acquired legally or illegally, then there's no particular currency or topicality to it that might be exploited or that might worry would fade away. All that was required was a vaguely contemporary set of illustrations for the cover, and then you're packaging a bunch of content that's been kicking around for 5 and 10 years. And there was none of the editorial content, the address from the editor, the letters from readers and so on, which, as Michael Warner has suggested quite influentially, is central to the building of social relations of circulation across the life of a periodical, building a public that follows in lockstep the unfolding of a magazine's history. Rather, so many of these commodities were intended to sell as long as they could still find buyers and to float in detached fashion through the murky markets of mid-1940s Toronto smut, basically. And in the context of a war in which people's mobility was increased, people were traveling further for various reasons, their distances were extended, the meeting up of buyer and artifact might take longer than was normally the case. There were just general ways in which things could find markets 1 or 2 years after their original release. Now let me say just a little more about this detemporalization. Large numbers of Canadian magazines from the late 30s and early 40s have their covers designed so that the dates can be altered. Typically it's revealed in a little strip sort of stuck in the upper left hand, or in the case of Canadian Tatler, the year is actually written over with ink, and that's ink on the original copy. That suggests last-minute alterations. A magazine doesn't sell so well, you bring it out a year later, you alter or disguise the year, and send it out again. All of these practices of detemporalization are symptoms of working in a kind of unorganized, confused market in which the commercial longevity of anything really is unclear, in which you can maybe sell something over and over again in small amounts over long periods. And this is a historical era, the mid-1940s, increasingly when the points of sale are no longer the conventional newsstand on the corner or the drugstore with its regular replacement of newspapers and magazines, but rather under-the-counter pornography shops, military-based variety stores, mail-order houses, and so on. Now, delocalizing is the third of the strategies that I want to talk about after genre masquerade and detemporalization. And I'm not going to say much about this because it's sort of the best known one, the idea that you hide or distort where your commodity got made. This is, this constantly circulates. This came up with BuzzFeed last week. We finally know where Schitt's Creek is set. The cast tries to keep it vague, and I love this. We don't know. There's no location for it, co-star and creator and star Eugene Levy told Stephen Colbert in January. There's no setting. There's no country. It is what it is. He's already joking about what we know to be the condition of so much Canadian culture. There's no need to talk about all the films in which Montreal stands for New York, or in which, as in Hairspray, for example, parts of Hamilton and the East End of Toronto stand for 1950s Montreal. These are part of a well-studied political economy of the international film industry with its divisions of labor. But in the case of these magazines from the 1940s, however, the impulse to deny the place of origin was tempered by an important function of these magazines, which was that of separately advertising books to be sold through the mails. A majority of the publishers involved in the so-called golden age of Canadian pulp probably made most of their money running secondary operations selling certain kinds of books, marriage manuals, kissing instruction manuals like the one on the left, reprinted semi-pornographic novels, which might be Madame Bovary or might be something else, true confessions books, and so on. Selling these required offering at least a post box, and that required naming a city. And so it's through these addresses that when the address of publication is otherwise missing, we can still decipher that something is published in Canada. And this gets into questions of the degree to which we're talking about separate companies or single enterprises using the same name. 135 Yonge Street, again, hosted companies called Famous Publications, Golden Books of America, Fireside Publications, and the Metropolitan Publishing Company. And if these were not under single ownership, we don't know, or I don't know, they nevertheless constituted some kind of network of interrelated publishing and mail order concerns. And they would very often, as in the case there, put New York and Toronto or something like that to suggest that they had a big operation in New York, when really they simply had a source for some of the materials. Now, before I turn away from magazines, and before I leave the 1940s, I want to talk for a few minutes about what I think is one of the most interesting examples of a Canadian cultural artifact. And this one combines the three strategies I've just talked about: genre masquerade, detemporalization, delocalization. But it adds another one that I'll come to in a second. Oops. So this from 1949 is an example of perhaps the longest lasting Canadian true crime magazine of the so-called Golden Age. Famous crime cases published by Superior. The Superior Company is interesting. It was started by the Ruby family of Toronto, who would go on to run tabloid newspapers in the 50s and 60s and produce children like Clayton Ruby, the well-known Toronto activist lawyer. Superior Publications was more respectable, as I said earlier, than most pulp publishers, and it proudly proclaimed, at least during World War II, that its magazines were 100% written and illustrated by Canadians. Now, the articles the true crime articles in this issue were indeed written by Canadians, but note that the cover advertises something else. That bound into the middle of this magazine are 32 pages of comics. This is what they look like in the middle of the magazine. These comics were not written and illustrated by Canadians, but rather borrowed, probably paid for, from the Gleason Company, which was a big American publisher of comic books of the time, and borrowed from titles Crime Does Not Pay and Crime and Punishment. Those were the two key American titles from which Famous Crime Cases took its materials. Now, I want us to think for a moment about what kind of media object this is, and about the kinds of relationships that it sets up and then sort of freezes in some kind of material way. This is a Canadian media artifact, a true crime magazine, that transports into Canada an American media artifact, hidden, if you like, in its center. I don't want to over-dramatize this. But in doing so, when you look at this, what happens is it sort of lays bare, it confesses the gaps of credibility, esteem, vitality that divide Canadian cultural commodities during this period from American cultural commodities. What you have are fairly drab, black and white Canadian true crime stories about Hamilton, Ontario, or Winnipeg, bookending color, exciting US comic book stories taking place in New York and Chicago and so on. And it's a bit like the black and white National Film Board films that fill gaps in the programming of sort of low-end cable specialty networks in Canada, like Silver Screen Classics, which I'm always surprised to find out is still existing. But there are other, what I would call intermediate relations that I find interesting here. What you have is, for example, a declining cultural form, which is the true crime magazine, being propped up in a way by an ascending cultural form, which is the comic book. In the US, and subsequently in Canada, the rise of the comic book in the 1940s helped kill off the pulp magazine generally. So did the rise of the paperback too. Between them, they kind of set pulp magazines on a long decline and drove them to marginal status. And so what we have here is, in a true crime magazine hosting comics in the middle of it, a kind of freezing of a particular moment in this transition. I'd like to say it's almost like hieroglyphic, because it's a visual manifestation of this transition. And this interests me a lot because I'm interested in one media being used to prop up the other. We can think of music or film magazines that used to come with CDs attached to their covers, back when you thought that the magazine was dead and the CD would live forever. These moments in media history, sorry, those are the, this would be an example of those from 2009. What a year. And these moments in media history, when one medium carries another almost as a kind of prosthesis, are always full to me of interesting clues about media transitions. Here are two Quebec examples that I find kind of interesting, operating at very different levels of cultural prestige. One is Sept, which is a kind of very popular magazine that offers you a CD of Elvis Presley singing Christmas songs, because we know how big Elvis Presley is in Quebec. The other is a very well-respected, almost academic Quebec film magazine, 24 Images, offering you a CD, if you can make that out, of some of the short, more inaccessible films of the Winnipeg filmmaker Guy Maddin. Now, each of these, I think, marks the attempt by one media to garner what it even imagines is the greater appeal of the other. And each stands as well as a kind of gesture of affinity. Sept is saying, our readers are like people who would like Elvis Christmas songs. 24 Images is saying, our readers are the sort who would appreciate this, perhaps the only Anglo-Canadian filmmaker that we're interested in, but that's another story. But this artifact, get back to famous crime cases, freezes another moment of transition in Canadian publishing, when restrictions were starting to be lifted on the importation of US periodicals, and when the already established true crime magazine seemed like the only way it could survive was to sort of add this other thing that was going to come into Canada anyway, so let's get it inside ourselves in order to sell it. And this example is complicated even further by the fact that in 1949, this is a famous moment in the history of Canadian morality, Member of Parliament Dave Fulton introduced legislation in the House of Commons to render criminal the publication, distribution, and sale of crime comics in Canada. So I like to see this true crime magazine with its comics hidden inside it as a kind of Trojan horse in which comics are coming into Canada hidden so as not to be seen by the agents of Canadian law and morality. Now, one other thing about this magazine, they're one response to what I see as another dilemma of commodity production, of cultural commodities in Canada. Famous Crime Cases offers comics because it knows it has to offer something more. It has to offer an abundance to compete with the American products that are slowly creeping back into Canada, and to overcome the air of cheapness that starts to attach itself to Canadian popular publishing after World War II. And in the history of Canadian cultural commodities, the offering of an abundance of more is one version of a non-standard form, where you offer more than is typical in a way to get buyers, readers, and so on. Most of the time, of course, we're used to Canadian cultural commodities offering less content than their US equivalents. Canadian comic books, regular comic books of the 40s and 50s, used to have 36 pages, whereas their American equivalents had 52. Canadians know that the number of films and television programs available through Amazon, Netflix, and YouTube are smaller than those available in the US. But occasionally, as with famous crime cases, the offering of an abundance comes all of a sudden as a sort of gift. It upgrades the Canadian cultural commodity in ways that are sometimes expected. And there are other examples of this. K-Tel, the Winnipeg-based record label that had 22 songs on one 12-inch album. You weren't even supposed to put that many, but they squeezed them on, and therefore that very abundance helps them become an international company. One of my favorites, a Montreal-based media company called Madoski, which I think is now out of business, but was until recently one of the last firms actually manufacturing CDs and DVDs in Canada. And in the early mid-2000s, they start bringing out they're really CD-ROMs that look like CDs with hundreds of MP3s on them for $9.99, so that those who didn't know how to download music from the internet could nevertheless fill the iPod that they just bought. And this abundance, again, is part of the air of cheapness that surrounds this company, but it's a strategy with which Canadian producers sometimes turn. Let me turn now to my second cluster of examples, which will be briefer. And this is the period from roughly 1974 to 1984, when Montreal was known as one of the world's key centers for the production of disco music recordings. If you heard me, probably if you know me, talk about this lots of different times. There's some new stuff here, I promise. Like the golden age of Canadian pulp in the 1940s, the 70s heyday of Montreal disco is now sort of recognized. This is not anymore a forgotten history. There's been a Quebec feature film, Funky Town, about this period from 2011. There have been radio documentaries, television retrospectives, online articles. I have one on the Red Bull Music Academy site and so on. And I'd suggest even that these two periods and these two clusters of cultural production have some similarities. In both cases, we're talking about minoritarian cultures engaged in making cultural materials that were regarded at the time of being of low esteem. Pulp publishing in Toronto in the 1940s was mostly the work of marginal Jewish entrepreneurs, many of them, as it turns out, with significant left-wing affiliations. And in the 1970s, large numbers of those who worked in the disco field were Italian Quebecois, who worked alongside Franco-Quebecois mixers, retailers, producers, and so on. And there was a lot of involvement of Latino Quebecois and so on. In both cases as well, the production of cultural artifacts, magazines in the 40s, disco records in the 70s, involved very minute calculations about how much you reveal of the fact that these are Canadian. How much do you conceal or reveal their Canadian provenance? The difference is that for the publishers of the 1940s, there's no imagining that you could find an audience outside of Canada. So you simply either admit it that they're Canadian or you try and dress them up as American. Whereas for disco producers of the 1970s, the possibility of circulating outside Canada was really the whole point. This was an industry designed for international circulation. So pulp publishers often disguise their materials to enhance their legitimacy, disguise them as American. Disco producers in the 1970s disguised their Montrealness to help them circulate more easily in international markets. Now, over the years, I've returned in my writing on various occasions to this really interesting media artifact that is the 12-inch dance music single. These are two examples of that. I've been obsessed with the mediality of this for 20 years. The 12-inch single, the size of an album, but really only containing one song, was introduced in the early to mid-1970s, first in New York, so that dance songs could be extended in a dance club without a loss of quality. Songs could contain extended musical breaks, instrumental breaks, and DJs could then use these as transitions as they move from one song to another. And the 12-inch single was a tool for DJs, but very quickly became a commodity to be sold to buyers. And as a commodity, it was designed for quick mobility. The commercial life cycles of these things were very brief. You know, they had a week or two when they were hot. And yet they somehow had to circulate across broad international circuits because newsletters and phone calls and so on were spreading the word that this record was hot around Western Europe, around the eastern seaboard of the United States, down to Miami, Mexico City, and so on. And so it's a commodity designed to move quickly. And Montreal, that was positioned strategically between New York and France, I mean, it's not geographically between New York and France, but in terms of circuits of cultural influence and between French and English, became a city through which records traveled, but it also became a key city in which records were made. Now, again, I don't want to repeat things that I've said somewhere else, but the 12-inch single bears a particular relationship to information, and this I think is interesting. Most of the singles were sold and moved with generic sleeves. The sleeves might bear the name of the label, but not the title of the song because you use the same sleeves for many different songs. Or they might just be white with no inscriptions at all. This detached the disco single in large measure from the visual culture of celebrity, of pictures of the artist with his friends and family, pictures of the artist on vacation, and all the detailed liner note information which marked other kinds of records, notably the rock album. And yet, if the sleeves were bare, the records themselves, I think we can see as complex informational clusters. And this is what interests me. This is a record, not that one. This is a record I didn't know I had until I went rummaging my basement last week for records to talk about today. And it gives us no information on the singer, Anne Joy, what she might look like, what mood or style is embedded in the experience of the record, even really where she's from or anything like that. But nevertheless, if we look at the information on this, whole universes, I would suggest, open up. If we go to the enlargement of the label on the right, we see that this record was released by a specialty label that belonged to the quite important Quebec company Unidisc. But this specialty label made records specifically for professional DJs, and in particular at professional mobile disc jockeys. That is, those who didn't play in clubs, but who went around to events and set up and performed on a kind of freelance basis. We can perhaps divine from the names of the producers over there on the right that this was made within the Italian Latino subcultures that were important in Montreal disco. We can see as well that it was produced by the tiny specialty Montreal label Igloo, which had a very short life, and that it was distributed by Downtown Records in Montreal. Now, Downtown was a distributor, but also the name of a store that I'd go to actually in the 1980s, although as a fan and not a professional disc jockey, I was not made welcome. But stamped on the sleeve and on the record itself is the name of the presumed purchaser of this record, a disc jockey named Suzanne Etier. She stamped her name both on the sleeve and on the record itself. This itself is significant given the low number of female DJs at this point, and one can assume that this stamping was intended to guarantee her ownership of the record in professional contexts like multiple DJs working at a club or at a party when it might get lost. And the little circle on the left featuring the MAPL certification is the certification for Canadian content that appeared on most Canadian records of this time that determined whether it was eligible for whether it could count as Canadian content when played on the radio. The word vocal in parenthesis following the song's title is information for the disc jockey indicating that the other side will probably be instrumental and that bits of that could be used to extend the first side. The song or track is by Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotte, who were both big-time European writer-composers at the time, both best known for having brought Donna Summer to stardom. Moroder brought out another version of this song with a different singer, and this one basically traveled the world, and with a particularly strong take-up in Mexico. So, anyways, there's much that could be said, but the question that I want to be deciphered in a way is why, when everybody else in the world was listening to this version, was there a specific version produced in Montreal, produced by a singer whose original name was Anna Goya, but who changed it to Anne Joy for her brief career as a Canadian disco singer, which I only found out on the internet this week. Well, the reason I think is that this made it Canadian content. Having it recorded by a Canadian made it Canadian content, also produced by a Canadian. And in an era when rock bands had stopped in Canada, had stopped covering songs from somewhere else, because that was corny or old-fashioned, disco was still a terrain on which the copy and the cover was common. And to cover this in Montreal with a Canadian singer and Canadian producers gave you the points, which allowed you to get priority on the radio, and so on. Now, in an article titled Archiving the Data Body, Jeff Cox, Nicolas Melevé, and Michael Murtaugh suggest that forensics turn the archive into a collection of data. And I'm interested in the way in which the label on Love Now, Hurt Later is really nothing more than a collection of data. There's no rhetorical flourishes. There are no adjectives. It really is a set of descriptions of collaborations, of relationships. It reveals relationships between the local and the transnational. It also confesses the regulatory system under which this record comes out, that is that of Canadian Content Regulation and the MAPL system that determined if your record was really Canadian. And these labels are like the business memorandum, as John Guillory has famously theorized, much of whose information is simply meta-information about the places from which this thing comes and instructions really as to some of the places to which it can go. Now, let me turn to two other examples of the disco 12-inch single, both from 1981. One is World Invaders by someone called Pluton and the Humanoids. The other is Crème Soufflée by someone calling himself Purple Flash. The first acknowledges that it's released by a Canadian company based in Willowdale, Ontario, although the made in Germany that you say there is unclear. Does this mean it was pressed in Montreal and distributed in Willowdale? That wouldn't make sense. Was it the masters sent to Willowdale? At this point, we don't know. The name of the authors and producers, though, seem francophone, that suggest it maybe wasn't made in Willowdale, or maybe even not in Germany. The label for Crème Soufflée is more evasive. Nothing indicates that this might have been produced, manufactured, or distributed in Canada, unless you know that the three letters PRO in there stand for Performing Rights Organization, a Canadian rights organization. Both of these records circulated widely through international markets, particularly in Europe, where they were taken as emblematic of the sensibility and sounds of Euro disco in the early 1980s. Sexy with high-end rhythms, not so much of the Latin beat that you would find in New York disco, and so on. In the 2000s, 20 years later, World Invaders, the one on the left, would come to be rediscovered and hailed as a kind of early proto-techno electronic dance music track, and later still rediscovered or reclaimed as an example of 1980s Italian disco. I've written about this in an article. But the names of the performers in both these cases was a cover-up. They're the same person, or the same set of persons, well, really the same persons. And although they were received in Europe as probably European, perhaps a little bit French, that was never clear. The vocals on both of them kind of hide or mask the place of origin. On World Invaders, they're heavily filtered through electronics, so they sound robotic. On Crème Soufflée, there's an exaggerating, you get this in a lot of Quebec disco records, exaggerated English spoken by a non-Anglophone. Let's have a party tonight, and things like that. It's a bad imitation, but but what interests me in particular is that behind these records is one of the most interesting careers, in my view, in Quebec and perhaps Canadian music, the career of a man called Pierre Paul. Now, I've spoken about him before. I just want to use him to make certain points. A few years ago, I got to know Pierre Paul. I invited him to a conference, and I continued to dig deep into Quebec showbiz ephemera for coverage of his life and career. Now, his career has had its ups and downs, but it's a symptom of the dilemmas facing a musician of color in Quebec celebrity culture, from the 1960s onwards anyways. Pierre Paul was born in 1948 in Quebec of black and white parents. And when he entered show business in the early 1960s, the only role that one could imagine for him in music was to pretend to be an African-American performer. So first he was the Quebecois Johnny Mathis, and then he was the Quebecois James Brown. And a little later on, you can see as his hair grew out, the Quebec Michael Jackson. And this was obviously a symptom of racial stereotyping, but it was also symptomatic of what went on generally in Quebec popular music during the 1960s, where Anglo-American songs entered the Quebec market by being covered in French by local performers. And so Pierre Paul is kind of doing a double mimicry. He's imitating an African American, but also just generally imitating an American. And this is the role that occupied him between 1963 and, say, 1968. In 1965, he was a member of what they called yay bands, Les Beethoven, that covered Anglo-American rock, soul, and pop hits. Now, the late 1960s saw Quebec popular music turning away from cover bands. All of a sudden, everyone was into authenticity. Quebec performers were expected to write their own songs, to sing in some kind of Quebec joie, maybe, to recover older traditions of Quebecois music. And Pierre Perpall had no obvious place. And this is why you get articles like this from 1969. Pierre Perpall tente un retour. He tries a comeback. As he told me, what ruined his career then was the Woodstock Music Festival, enshrined as one of the great milestones in the history of Western youth culture. Well, for African-American performers like him, who were professional musicians who covered others, Woodstock's insistence on authenticity tended to favor the white rock performer. And so beginning in the late 1960s, Pierre Perpall traveled mostly as a session musician to the US. He played on cruise ships, in casinos, and then returned to Montreal in the early 1970s. When he returned, Montreal's disco culture was beginning to sort of take off. Clubs like the Limelight were opening. The role of the DJ was becoming professionalized. Labels and recording studios were emerging to produce new Montreal music. Versions of music coming already out of New York, Miami, and so on. And you find a whole set of collaborative relationships taking shape in Montreal, and musicians of color were very active in producing clusters, if you like, of activity around disco music. So many of these musicians of color, Afro-Quebecois musicians in particular, pursued separate careers, but they came together on occasion to make albums like this one, La Connexion Noire, which is basically a super group of black Quebecois artists all doing disco. And your president, before he left, said that he asked if I was going to show this album cover. African-American musicians African Quebecois musicians in Montreal did things like make disco records featuring backing tracks that they had sent up from Muscle Shoals Studio in Alabama. Female black vocalists from the US moved up to Montreal and were part of this scene for a while. Now, I don't want to tell the story of the whole of this scene here tonight, and I only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to return to the notion of the cultural artifact, the commodity, and explore this a little bit in the figure of Pierre Perpall. In the late 1970s, we might say, Pierre Perpall's identity became fractured, and that fracture has remained. In one side of his identity, he became a mid-level figure within Quebec show business, appearing on television, talk shows, variety shows, doing live sort of cabaret evenings, playing at the casino. His life was covered in Quebec's famous show business tabloids. Here he's 3 pages on his second wedding in Hebdo Vedette from May 14th, 1985, and so on. And what interests me are the two trajectories. This is one trajectory of his fame. This has kept him in a certain universe of Quebec celebrity. And that celebrity is, if you like, an audiovisual celebrity of pictures, of identity sort of filled in detail. The problem is that particular identity always risks, in a way, being vulgar or degraded. And there's the move in his career towards appearing like a kitsch figure a little bit has always been a kind of threat. And what's interesting is in recent years, he's had to go back to being sort of what he was in the 60s, covering the work of others, pretending, if you like, he's Lionel Richie, doing an evening where he sings the song of Lionel Richie and so on. Although he does it in a professional way, it's a particular kind of fate. But at the same time, the records he produced under different names in the late 70s and early 80s have circulated around the world with no clues as to his name, accompanied by no images of him, and hiding in many cases the places from which these records came. So just as he's doing tributes to Lionel Richie and being photographed with Celine Dion and so on, out there for the last 20 years, on the net and so on, he's become a kind of mythical figure in subcultures devoted to glorifying Italian disco of the 1980s, of which it's sometimes believed he was a part, even though he was working in Montreal, or techno music more generally. This is a slide from a 2013 website that suggests there's this mysterious man behind Pluto and the humanoids. They acknowledge that it's Pierre Paul. They acknowledge that he's one of the first black performers in Quebec, but beyond that, they say there's an enigma. Well, if you've read the 3 pages about his wedding, the enigma is not quite so strong. And indeed, now in this website and others, there are attempts to take this mysterious figure, Pierre Paul, and insert him in new histories of Afrofuturism and so on. And so there's a whole other world in which his name and his identity circulate in records that hide much of what might work against those particular interpretations. Now, when I began writing this paper, I thought I'd make a big point about how a media forensics of the sort I've tried to offer here would be the opposite of a political economy of media. A political economy begins with the economic arrangements and then kind of perhaps runs out of steam at the point at which the artifacts themselves appear. A media forensics would begin with the artifact and then look at the traces of the forces that brought it into being. Well, of course, we could use a forensics to get back to a political economy, and of course, a political economy, if it goes far enough and long enough, can get us to the traces that the object bears of the conditions under which it can be made. I prefer a media forensics because it can get us to think about form and style in format by maintaining that kind of close-up fixation on the object itself. Now, here's the big grand finale here, Foucault quote, which I only added an hour before I got on the train. Because I was trying to find a quote that argues for the importance of analyzing form. And this is really taking a hammer to kill a fly. But Michel Foucault is one of those who said that the study of forms is undervalued, at least in Western culture, and that a battle of forms has been a key part of many cultural histories. Well, again, to use these ideas to justify studying Canadian smutty magazines of the 1940s or 12-inch disco singles obviously seems trivializing, and I wish I could have found a less grandiose and dramatic defense of formal analysis. But I think looking at the mutant hybrid, what was the word you used? Louche, aberrant, eccentric forms of the Canadian cultural commodity, their repackaging of things from somewhere else, all the strategies of disguise and masquerade, revealing and hiding information, fragmenting and then recohering bits of pieces from here and there. All of these are part of an analysis of form, and I think, especially in the case of Canada, where notions of an essential, the idea that by studying Canadian culture we're going to get at some essential idea of national identity or of national cultural sensibilities, as these are increasingly shown to be problematic and untenable, a forensic analysis of media objects at least allows a kind of fresh approach to the Canadian cultural commodity. Wow, 8 o'clock on the dot.